have to wait for this thing to, turn on. All right. Oh, there we go. Hey, everybody. Great to see you. There's Marty waving. Hello in the back. Hello. Oh, right up front. Nice. Marty was afraid of dying last night, I think, after he got his shout out from God. Okay, so last night we talked about mercy, and we said that sin is a kind of wounding, remember? It's not a complete destruction, not a complete doing away with, but a kind of marring or alienation of a relationship. And what are the three most important relationships that we talked about yesterday? Anybody remember one of them? Me and God, me and me, and me and others, and creation, right? So the three basic relationships that we're constantly operating out of are the relationship between ourselves and God, between ourselves and ourselves. It's possible to be in a relationship with ourselves and ourselves and other people. And every time that we commit a sin, whether it's a big sin or a little sin, in some way, one of those or more than one of those relationships are disintegrated. The word integrate, brought together. So disintegrate is to bring two things apart. I got a betta fish a couple months ago. The kindergartners at St. Raymond School named their class goldfish Father Ryan the fish. And I may have had a little to do with that, but I'm taking classes right now for a master's degree from the University of St. Thomas, where I got my undergrad. So I have to go up there. It's online, but sometimes, like every month or so, I have to be up there for a couple days. So while I was up there, I had been away from the parish for like 3 or 4 days, and the fish died. And word began to spread that Father Ryan had died. But because I hadn't been there in a few days, and because I was still pretty new, there was a legitimate fear, not for days and days, but for a day or so, that Father Ryan the priest had died. And so to make me feel better, the staff, one day I came downstairs, we live above the shop. It's one of those kind of rectories, which is good and bad. But I come downstairs one morning, and in my office, on my desk, there's a tank with a filter and food and a fish. And I said, I guess I'm a fish owner now. I don't know what to do with a fish, so I nearly killed the fish. I did. I was putting Joliet water in the fish tank, which is, we don't even drink Joliet water, so I don't know why I thought a fish could live in Joliet water. It's full of hard metals and things. And so anyway, so his fins have literally disintegrated. Oh man, they're still there, but he says, used to be this big, beautiful betta fish, and now he's like this kind of, it looks like he got a haircut, but it's not gonna grow back. Anyway, so we just got him a new tank. And he went from 1 gallon to 10 gallons, and I really kind of invested in this thing. So the hope is that, I don't think the fins will grow, but that the disintegration will stop. So the long story is, that's what kind of happens when we sin. It's so weird, I'm sorry. But it's that idea of something that should exist, something that's helpful if it exists, being disintegrated. Over time, getting less and less, not so strong. And then eventually what happens if we keep destroying relationships, if we keep making moves against the relationship, eventually the relationship is just gonna kind of fizzle away, right? That's what happens. We need to set up boundaries for ourselves so that if we're constantly being sinned against by a certain person, like we probably need to distance ourselves from those people, right? So sin is a kind of disintegration of the relationship between me and God, between me and me, and between myself and other people. Mercy, therefore, if mercy is the remedy to sin, mercy, therefore, is not a movement away from the relationship, but a drawing closer to the relationship. It's a drawing near again. And we saw that with God, right? Every time the Israelites committed the sin and destroyed the covenant, what happened? God came looking for them in the garden in the cool of the day. God came back and looked for the people. God called the people back to himself. So he is the one who makes the first move, so to speak, into restoring the relationship with his people. That includes us. His people, right, as a community, he came to save all of us, but also with us as individual people. He came to save each of us. So mercy is a kind of drawing near again to the other and to ourselves. And this is why sin requires mercy. So remember that sin always wounds. Sin always wounds. Even if it's not a big sin, even if it's maybe just a little, scuffle or whatever, sin always wounds. It carries with it always a sense or a degree of this disintegration. There's no such thing as a harmless sin. Sin always creates a wound. And what does the wound look like? What has it brought us to? I think it's helpful for us to understand a vision of the human person as it was when we were created, when God created Adam and Eve in the garden, and us too, right? Because we looked at the timeline yesterday that there's something more original to us than our original sin. There's something more basic to us than our original sin. So what did that look like? What are we trying to get back to? So at his creation, Adam and Eve, they possessed, ready? They possessed a deep-seated, which means foundational, ordered, which means moving toward God, affinity, which is a desire, for reality. A deep-seated, ordered desire for reality. And we're going to define reality today as the cosmos according to God. In other words, we desire the way that God wanted it to be. We want to live in harmony with him. After the sin, Adam and Eve possess, and we likewise possess, a deep-seated, foundational, but disordered, meaning moving away from God, affinity, desire, for fantasy. And tonight we're going to define fantasy as the cosmos according to me. So before sin and in that state of being made in the image of God, and when we live in harmony with him, what's most foundational in us is this ordered, this good, this right directed desire for God's will, God's world, God's cosmos, God's plan. In the state of sin, because sin is essentially a choice of me, I'm choosing myself and my vision of the world. Fantasy, the cosmos according to me. So the condition of sin, we say that something deep within us is wounded, but reality itself is not changed. Reality itself is not totally wounded, but the way that we approach reality is wounded, is disintegrated. Does that make sense? Instead of saying, oh, I've sinned, which means God doesn't love me, no, God's the same. God is not changed because of our sins. God is immutable, means he doesn't change. We have changed. Our outlook on life has changed. Our ability to relate with others has changed. Our ability to receive grace has changed. But God himself, the reality that we're all called to live, has not changed. But now our approach to that reality has changed. Think about when somebody sins against you. Let's say you find out that a good friend of yours is making up a lie about you, or somebody comes out of nowhere and accuses you of something. Well, you're still you, and they're still them, but now the way that you're approaching each other is different. And that person could say, I'm really sorry, I didn't mean to do that, I didn't mean to say that, it just came out of a bad place. But from now on, there's always going to be that little part of us that is sort of like, this is never going to be the same, you know? There's this part of me that says, I'm never going to approach this person in the same way again, because something there has been wounded by distrust. So the wound we can call unlove, and then God becomes an enemy to us, or the other becomes an enemy to us, or I become an enemy to me. They become an obstacle, right? We said that yesterday. That's what Adam and Eve were looking for. Well, God said that we would have the knowledge of good and evil if we eat from this tree. He doesn't want us to have that because then we might be more powerful than him. So I'm just going to choose this. I'm going to choose because I want to live as I want to live. Remember that definition of sin that we talked about yesterday? I want what I want, and I want it right now. I want what I want, and I want it right now. That's a good way to describe sin. Another way of describing sin is to say that it is our tendency to take what is meant to be received. It's a tendency to take, to control what is meant to be received. So much of our sin revolves around this idea of control. I need to control my image. I need to control my look. I need to control my words. I need to control the outcome. I need to be in control. And that's kind of a natural thing. I mean, we want to have a handle on our life. We don't want to live in chaos. But to say that I am the only one who knows what is my good is deeply flawed. And so we rebel and we commit sin and we try to fill ourselves up and we try to compensate. I would say most sins, and we can see it, it's hard to see in ourselves, but when we look at other people and we talk to other people, like I know very few truly genuine jackwads. So few, truly genuine, to their core, terrible people. I can't think of any, even off the top of my head. But I know of a lot of people who are acting out of these places of woundedness, acting out of these places of inadequacy, or of a lack of affirmation, or a lack of encouragement, or a lack of companionship. They're acting out of their loneliness, out of their bitterness, and that's why they act the way that they do. So why is it a problem if we move away from God? Well, you know the very famous line from St. Augustine, right? Our hearts are what? Restless until they rest in you, right? We've all heard that 100,000 times. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. You have made us for yourself. Now, you have to go to the Latin. You don't have to, but you should. And what are you going to find there? What did Augustine write? You have made us for yourself. He could have used two words. Facisti. I want bolognese with extra facisti. Facisti in Latin means you have made. So facisti nos prote or ad te. Prote is like ora pro nobis. Do this for me. I have made you for myself, to live with me, to be my servant or my friend, a utilitarian kind of making. I've made you for myself, literally for my own use, for my own benefit. But Augustine wrote facisti ad te, which what does ad, A-D, in Latin mean? Think of like ad orientem or ad nauseam or ad infinitum. It means toward. It's the word toward. So you have made me toward you, and my heart is restless until it rests in you because you've made me, built me, hardwired me to move toward you. So when I sin and I move away from you, of course there's going to be an interior struggle. Of course there's going to be difficulty. It's going to be like watching a 6-year-old play with his Thomas the Tank Engine trains, and he can't figure out that the magnets are never going to go together unless he just turns them around. There's this tension that he cannot resolve. The two magnets are always going to be opposed to one another. And that's kind of what happens inside of our soul. There's this deep discomfort. It's like this existential angst almost. This deep disquiet, restlessness. Our hearts are restless until they rest in you, not because you've made me to be your slave, prote, but because you've built me to go toward you. That my desire is not being fulfilled unless I'm moving toward you. That God, you called me out of nothingness. He created the whole world out of nothing. And so to move toward him is to move always toward new, toward life, towards creation, towards fulfillment. And to move away from him is to move farther and farther away back toward nothingness. So Thomas Aquinas described, he said, there's no such thing as cold. Cold is simply the absence of heat. There's no such thing as dark. Dark is simply the absence of light. There's no such thing as evil. Evil is simply the absence of good. So we measure all these things in terms of their positive, that there's no such thing as cold in itself, but there's just a lack of heat, either more heat or lack of heat. And the lack of heat is what we call cold. So if you've ever read Dante's Divine Comedy, the most famous religious poem written in the Western tradition, he describes the place where Satan lives, not as full of flames and fire, but he says it's cold, ice cold, and that the devil is stuck in the ground at the very pit of the universe. And he's an angel, he's a fallen angel. And so all Satan can do is flap his wings, so it will never be warm, because all he does is spread the coldness around him. But if we think about it from the place of, obviously, cold and evil, that person's really cold, we can look at it on that level, and that's a pretty profound level in itself. But now take it one step further to what I was just talking about. That cold does not exist. Cold is a lack of heat. He's the most evil creature. So there's a lack of goodness. He is living as close, Dante, when he's visiting Satan, is living as close to literal nothingness as possible. He's in the presence of the most cold being, the most evil being, and the most dark place. And so when Dante is down there, he describes it, he says, it's like I was dead and yet not dead. It's like when a Dementor in Harry Potter gets to you and they start to suck your soul away. It's kind of what I was thinking about. So when we move so far away from God, it's like this kind of spiritual suffocation in a way. I can hardly breathe. I can hardly get back on my feet. I can hardly experience the thing that I'm longing for. I can hardly even call it to mind. Now that's obviously very far away. I hope none of us are that far away. My spidey senses tell me none of us are that far away, so we should be okay. So the wounds of sin, either committed by us or the sins committed against us, they possess some kind of power. Sin always wounds, and the wound has power. And what does the wound often want to do? The wounds that we experience, they want to justify their existence. So the hurt caused by our sins wants to make sure it can be around. That is to say, the problem is never us. The problem is always someone else. The problem is always something else. And so the power of sin within us is not that it makes us be possessed by Satan or anything, but that it makes us build these walls to keep other people out. The farther and farther we retreat into sin, especially the more comfortable we become in sin, it's like the slower and slower our arm goes up. And soon we become these people who I call the arm's lengthers, It's great to be around them. They're often very fun, but I don't know anything about you. I don't have any knowledge of your life. I don't know what you love. I don't know what makes you happy. I don't know any of that. I just know that you like Coke and not Pepsi, and that you're a Sox fan and not a Cubs fan. I know these terrible things about you. And so what happens then is it creates this cycle, doesn't it? Because then we often feel hurt by those people. Or when we're those people, we don't realize the hurt that we cause people. Because at our core, if we're made in the image of God, then we're made in the image of a community, right? He's a community, Father, Son, and Spirit. We're made in that image. And if we're made to go toward a community, we're craving community. And so when I'm close to someone and it's like I just keep bumping up against their arm all the time, then I start to say, well, what's wrong with me? Is there something wrong with me? Like, why can't I break through that? Why do they have walls that I can't get through? And so here's the painful reality that we all know too well, which is that hurt people hurt people. Hurt people hurt people. And that's just the reality of it. And that's going to be the cycle, always the cycle, until we can come in and chop it off. We will play the victim. It's somebody else's fault. It's not me. Or we succumb to the fear of looking inside, of introspection. Because what I might find in there could be hurtful, could be surprising. It could mean I have to do a lot of work to make myself be free so that I can achieve the freedom of the sons of God that's being promised to me. A lot of you know from my time here that my own parents are divorced, and they got divorced when I was 12, and I think I was in 7th grade, between 7th and 8th grade. And they got divorced because my dad is an alcoholic. He's a recovering alcoholic, thanks be to God. He hasn't had a drink in a very long time, so I'm very happy about that. But he had been drinking since he was 12, and my mom never knew. Because when you drink starting when you're 12 and now you're 50, whatever, you become what we call high functioning, right? And you can't always tell. And I remember one time I was driving with my dad. I was really little, and he stepped on the gas and there's a bottle flew out from under the seat. And I said, "Dad, what's this?" And he said, "Well, it's windshield wiper fluid, son." And from that day on, it was always my dream to be a thirsty windshield, but that's a different story. And he used to keep his, hide his alcohol in our house in the tackle box in the basement with all his fishing stuff. Just gonna check out my fishing stuff for the 50th time today, And so they didn't get divorced because they hate each other. My parents don't hate each other. In fact, they get along very well. And it's not that my dad's a bad guy. He's not a bad guy. In fact, he's kind of, for me, an image of what redemption looks like. He's got a great job, he's remarried, he lives in Michigan, he's got kids. It's a beautiful story. But it was this cycle of hurt that whatever, when he was 12, started that pain in him that thought he had to drink to cover it up. And then whatever happened through life, that just became the go-to, to the point where we're not going to tell anyone. It's just going to be a part of my hidden life. That's the cycle of pain, And now, because of his decisions over his life, I had to go to counseling, which is good. I loved counseling, to be honest with you. Me and Eileen, we got along great, okay? She was fun. Sort of fun. Yeah. Anyway, but because of that hurt that he experienced that he didn't deal with, or no one gave him the tools to deal with, or like we talked about yesterday, it was taboo to talk about or to deal with, now he's caused hurt in my brother, who lives in the city and has this great big job and doesn't talk to my dad anymore, He had caused the pain in my mother, who always says, "I never thought I'd be a divorced woman," who's now become one of the holiest women that I know, So God is bringing life out of this, but something had to happen so that the cycle would stop. And my dad always says it was, my parents getting divorced, it was a lot of other things that happened at that time, losing his license, losing his job, that created this kind of barrier now that the cycle would stop. Rock bottom is what stops the cycle if we're not careful, right? Rock bottom is not the place we want to have to crawl back up from. So the cycle continues until love is able to return into a situation. Ultimately, until love himself is able to be let back in. But we have to remember that Jesus is so respectful. Jesus is so respectful. He is never going to barge into your life. He is never just going to walk right in and take you over. We often describe it that way, that's sometimes how grace comes. It knocks us upside the head. But he has given us the freedom to choose him or not to choose him. But just because we don't open the door does not mean that the Lord is going to stop knocking. "Behold, I stand at the door and knock," says Jesus, right? And he does not need our permission to knock and knock and knock. And he will not stop knocking, ever. He may stop to switch hands, because it hurts, or he may stop to get a sandwich or something, but he is never going to stop knocking and walk away from us. So the question that we need to ask ourselves before we go any further is, do you believe that Jesus wants to take care of you? Do you believe that Jesus wants to take care of you? Do you believe that Jesus is looking at you with such tenderness and mercy that he's saying to you, "I don't really care what your claimed obstacle is. I'm unworthy, I'm too sinful." He says, "I don't really care. I want to take care of you. I want you to let me in to the point where I can transform you." We're living in a very Protestant culture right now. America has sort of always been a influenced by the Protestant worldview, which remember that their view of sin is what? That our souls are made of dung, they've become completely dirty and irredeemable, and that baptism is like snow that comes and covers that. So it looks pretty and it's nice, but underneath it's still just poop. And that Jesus on the cross, with his arms outstretched, stands in front of us, between us and the Father, so that the Father just looks at the perfect sacrifice of his Son and doesn't actually see us. But the Catholic Church has never subscribed to that, and thanks be to God. Because the Church would say, what? What about when Paul says, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me? Or tomorrow we'll talk about Colossians 3, that I have died and my life is hidden now with Christ in God, so that when Christ appears, I appear with him. Like, we can be transformed to such an extent that it's not us who live anymore, but it's the life of God living within us. One of the most important images from my life and my discernment of the priesthood that I ever heard was I went on a come and see weekend at a seminary in Missouri, and it was at a Benedictine monastery, and the priest who was giving the homily that day, I mean, he was old, all right, ancient of days, and I remember he was just leaning on the ambo on the podium during his homily. And he said, gentlemen, Jesus is kneading your heart. K-N-E-A-D, kneading your heart. And he said, the Lord has taken your heart if you've given it to him, if you've given him permission to come and take it. He has taken your heart and he's kneading it. And you know the image of the Old Testament with the stony hearts. God says, I will take your stony hearts and give you a natural heart in Ezekiel. And so this priest said, God is taking your stony hearts, and he's so gentle. He just rubs them and massages your heart until eventually the stone begins to break away, and underneath we see flesh. Natural heart begins to appear. And he strips very carefully the rock and the stone away, and he just keeps kneading. And he says, eventually, all of this is covered in flesh. And then he takes the oil of gladness, joy and hope and life, and he pours it onto that heart so that it gets softer and softer. It just gets softer as he pours oil on it. And it gets so soft that eventually his fingerprints begin to get stuck in that heart. And so when people see that heart and they see it covered with the divine DNA of the living God, they will look at it and say, whose heart is that? Is that your heart, or is that the heart of Jesus? Because I can't tell. Because that's how radically transformed and new he has made your heart. And that was the homily. That was the moment when I knew that I was being called to be a priest. Because I wanted to experience that so badly. But then there was the part of me that said, that the Lord was saying to me, and I want you to play a role in bringing people to that reality as a priest through the sacraments. And so I picture every time I eat communion, this is so cheesy, but every time I take communion at Mass, I picture it like an Alka-Seltzer being dropped into my soul, and it just fizzes around, and it aids in that process of breaking up the stone, breaking up the hardness, and fostering the coming of new life into me. What a far cry from the other worldview that we're up against. What a far cry. Because we hear, in the world, if you rob a bank, someone goes in and robs Kramer's, which I never did, obviously. But if I had no reason to rob Kramer's. The parish has an account there, I just had to tell them the number. So you bought a lot of my food, thanks. But anyways, let's say I had robbed Kramer's. I would be forever known as that seminarian who lived at Notre Dame who robbed Kramer's. I would be the robber. That's how the culture would remember me. And it'd be kind of funny for a while, but maybe you didn't know that I moved to India and became a philanthropist, and I've changed my ways, and I've atoned for my sins, and I'm actually living a pretty good life. I'd still be a robber. I'd still be a murderer. I'd still be an adulterer. I'd still be the divorced lady, whatever. That we look at each other according to what we've done and not about who we ultimately are. We see only as deep as our original sin. But we forget that there's something that is deeper than our original sin, right? Okay. Do you believe that Jesus wants to take care of you? So my question now is, what do you think is the fulfillment of a loving relationship? In other words, what is the deepest desire of love? If someone were to ask you that question, your kids or a student or a family member or whatever, Mom, what's the deepest desire of love? What would you say? Reciprocation? Reciprocation is very powerful, right? There's nothing more beautiful, and I mean nothing more beautiful, than having the courage to say, I love you to someone, and not for them to say, ditto, but for them to say, I love you too. There's nothing more powerful than that, right? That's beautiful. What else? Love's desire is to will the good of the other, yes? To become, like to be transformed by the love, you mean? Okay. To show honor and to be honored, yep. Acceptance, compassion. So to protect the one we love and to feel protected by them. Both ways, yeah. To take care of each other, a kind of mutual responsibility, right? What else? Forgiveness, yeah, very good. I want to argue tonight, though, those are not wrong, but I think the deepest desire of love is self-revelation for the sake of unity. Remember that God's main goal is that we might share with him in his blessed life, right? We said that yesterday. God's main goal for his creation is that they would come to share in his life, that they would be in union with him. So, how did he accomplish that? Ultimately by revealing himself in the person of Christ. Love himself revealed himself in the person of Christ. And so, you know, like when you make a friend and you're talking and you're getting to know each other, oh my gosh, yo, Clarendon Hills, I live in Clarendon Hills. Oh, what, Notre Dame? Oh, I have family in Notre Dame. Wow, that's really great. You want to come over sometime? Yeah, we're playing Yahtzee together now on the weekends. It's so fun. More wine? Why not? You know, we're going together. Whoop, whoop. And then like the next point in the conversation that could come is like the point where the natural place where your conversation could go is to a place that would require you to say something in vulnerability, that would require you to say that thing or tell that thing that you didn't want to tell anyone. But you've reached this place in your relationship where I think I might be ready to share that. I think I might be ready to go there with them. And you can either do it, break the glass ceiling and do it, or you can choose not to do it. And we've all been in this relationship so many times. But what happens if we choose not to do it? What happens if we get to this place where we're feeling comfortable and it just feels natural, it feels right? I think that maybe I could confide in this person, and then we choose not to. Yeah, so thanks for coming over. Yeah, it's been a great time. Wow, I haven't seen you in a while. How you doing? Wow, I haven't really talked in a while. Yeah, sorry I haven't called. I've just been so busy with the kids. And hey, nice to see you. It's been a year or so. And oftentimes those relationships fizzle out because what they're ultimately going to be based on, what's going to ensure the deepest relationships of our lives, the success of those, is this kind of self-revelation for the sake of being united with each other. Because I cannot love what I don't know. So how can I love you if I don't know you? And this was the thing with my parents. This huge part of my dad's life that nobody knew. How can I love what I don't know? So ultimately we're here for union with God. That's finite togetherness. But finite together, or infinite togetherness, I should say, begins with finite togetherness here. The goal of Christianity is that the world might become free. St. Paul says it over and over that we're called to live in the freedom of the sons of God. So the goal of Christianity, God's transforming power, is that we might become free. And what do I mean by freedom? In the world today, there's kind of a reduction of freedom from the Christian idea that says, I am free if I don't have any bonds. if I don't have any rules, if I don't have any guidelines, then I'm free. And remember when we were kids, we tried to one-up each other in freedom. I get to eat whatever I want for dinner. Oh yeah, well, I don't have to come in at a certain time. Oh yeah, well, when I get home, I get to play as many video games as I want. Oh yeah, well, I never have to do any chores. Oh yeah. And of course, we were all lying to each other because none of that was true. But it was cool to be free. It was cool to be seen as autonomous, independent. I don't have any bonds keeping me down. Except for one bond called myself. Because what happens then? If I don't have anybody else to answer to, the only thing that guides my decision making is my own passions, my own whims, my own desires. And then I become a slave to them. It becomes impossible to say no to myself and to my every whim and desire. So then you're still a slave. But the reality is that these bonds, these guidelines, they're not harmful for us. We're all terrible bowlers, probably every one of us. Our main goal in life is to bowl a strike, but you don't know which way to do it or which ball to take. And some people say, I don't need bumpers on my bowling lane. I'm going to do this by myself. Fine, but you're never going to bowl a strike because you stink at bowling. But I stink at bowling too. So I'm going to have bumpers, and I'm going to have bumpers pretty proudly. But my bumpers have names. They're called the 10 Commandments, the sacraments, church teaching, friendships, community, Christian fraternity. It's called vulnerability, virtuous life. These things that so many of us have come to see as roadblocks to our happiness, they're not roadblocks, they're bumpers so that we don't fall off the narrow way. Jesus said there's a narrow way and there's a wider way. And he says, how is that wider way that leads to death? The narrow way is more treacherous, but it is the way that leads to life. All the while that's happening, Jesus, the divine bowling coach, is standing behind us, fixing our arm, helping us with our follow through, maybe helping us do that fancy behind the leg thing when we throw the ball. Here's the, the right weight of a ball that you need, etc. And he's walking us through it. He's talking us through it. He's being with us. He's come to us to help us become the good bowlers that we're destined to be. Now, that's a cheesy analogy, but you all loved it. And you're going to use it. I know you will. So what then is a good way that we can define Christian freedom? What does it mean for me to say that I'm free? It's not to say I have no bonds that keep me down, and it's not saying that I'm perfect in every way. I have all of my problems worked out. Because again, we'd be lying to each other. To be free in the Christian sense simply means to be myself, but within reality, to combine the cosmos according to me and the cosmos according to God. Do they match or not? So to be free according to reality, to be myself within reality says, here's my problems. Here they all are, but they don't define me, and that each one of these things is an opportunity for me to become holy, for me to become transformed and united with God. Each one of these things is not an obstacle, but an opportunity. Remember that the birth of glory is always received in grief. Any other questions? That what the world would call defeat, we call victory. What the world sees as an obstacle, a stumbling block, we call the wisdom of God and the knowledge of God and an opportunity to be conformed to Him. Remember that a snowy driveway is a lot easier to shovel than an icy driveway. We learned that this winter, didn't we? Think of your interior life as like an interior geography. Think of your soul as like the Grand Canyon. There are parts of it can be explored, first of all, and there are parts of it that are so beautiful, that are so breathtakingly beautiful, things that are unique to only you and that are just amazing. And there's some parts that are just covered in gravel and donkey poop. There's some parts that are totally blocked and that need to be cleared. And there's some parts that are visited by people hundreds of times a day. Think of your soul as like a self-cleaning oven. The Holy Spirit comes in and superheats that baby. And finally, Grandma's Thanksgiving lasagna from 1985 is gone. That terrible day, the gunk just falls off. And sometimes there's some that remains, and then we got to do a little extra work, right? We got to go to therapeutic counseling, or we have to turn maybe to some kind of medication or whatever. I take one Lexapro every day. I've been doing it for a while, and it makes me feel good, okay? It's my happy pill. We all need a happy pill sometimes, all right? There's no shame in that. If God gave us the medicine, if God gave us the technology, then just use it. Who cares what other people say? If it's going to help you be you, then just do it, within reason. Okay, remember the bowling lanes, all right? So we use the word sometimes vulnerability. Ooh, nobody likes the word vulnerability. Vulnus in Latin means wound. So vulnerability means woundability, the ability to be wounded. And we hear often we have to embrace our vulnerability, right? We got to make ourselves vulnerable. Make yourself vulnerable. Well, that's nonsense. You're not making yourself woundable, because if you weren't already woundable, we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? You're not making yourself vulnerable. It's about taking advantage of the vulnerability that already exists. I'm not going to let that scare me away from freedom. I'm going to embrace it. I'm going to own it. I'm going to take advantage of it. And I'm going to become free. It requires courage. It requires being brave. It requires leaning into discomfort. Freedom is inconvenient. This kind of thing is messy. It's very hard, but it is the right thing. So, of course, in seminary, that was a big time of healing for me, and I realized that I was very wounded from a lot of things, my parents' divorce being one of them. And I found that I was crippled by shame and by anxiety. And then I opened up about them to one of my best friends, and it ended up causing a lot of difficulty in our friendship. He hated vulnerability. He thought it was pointless. It was just reckless sharing. I used to call him Vatican City because he had walls to protect his walls. And he used to call me a 14-volume encyclopedia whose pages blow in the wind. That's what he called me once. And so I had just assumed that the problem was me. I did the wrong thing. I said too much. I was too authentic. I was too brave. I was too courageous. So now we have the original shame, plus now the feelings of doubt and self-whatever, and the increased shame from having done this incorrectly, And I thought, vulnerability is stupid. Nobody should be vulnerable ever. Don't ever tell anybody about yourself. You must always live at arm's length. That's the safe place. But then I was recommended this book, and I stumbled across this book by Brené Brown. Has anyone ever heard of her? Love her, okay? She calls herself a shame researcher. I don't know. But she wrote this book called Daring Greatly, and it's how the courage to be vulnerable transforms the way we live, love, parent, and lead. This is one of the best books I've ever read. And I started reading her, and she showed me two things. Well, she showed me more than two things, but two of the main things. She said that if you're going to be vulnerable, you have to be vulnerable with somebody who is worthy to hear your story. Somebody who has earned the right to hear your story. There's a huge billboard in Joliet at the corner of Rainer and Jefferson, like 6 blocks from my house. And it's been empty since I got there in June. And it would not be the good idea for me to put a list of all my problems on the empty billboard, right? We're not going to go broadcast every little detail to every little person. So it has to be somebody who's worthy to hear your story. They likewise have gone through that ceiling, or you went through that ceiling, and they stayed right with you. I was just reading this fascinating book about the Lusitania sinking in World War I by Eric Larson. And the book is called Dead Wake. Eric Larson wrote Devil in the White City. He's so good. But anyway, he finds these ways of weaving these stories together. And so one of the things that he was talking about was in the midst of this time when the Lusitania was sailing, President Woodrow Wilson was in the midst of his own crisis because his wife had died and he had fallen in love with this woman. And he said, "Will you marry me?" And she said, "No, I will not marry you. I love you, but not like that, you know?" And he was like, "Oh, okay. Am I a big idiot? Like, are we still going to be friends?" And she said, I forget the exact quote, but it was along the lines of, "You have revealed yourself to me, and I will be with you." Amazing. So you have to be worthy to hear the story. But the other side of it is that this person has to be able to bear the weight of it. That the person has to be able to bear the weight of your story. If someone is not willing to acknowledge the power of being with people, of self-revelation for the sake of building up a relationship, if they're not willing to acknowledge that power or that necessity, then perhaps they're not able to carry the weight of the thing that you're about to tell them. Now, it's easy when you have a counselor because you're paying them to be able to bear the weight of it. But in just an everyday friendship, you have to find someone who is willing to do this work themselves, or at the very least, is willing to hear you out and not, "Ooh, whoa, you want to marry me, President Wilson? Ooh, you have a heartbreak because your wife just died? Too icky for me to get into." We don't want that. So when I eventually told my friend about my side of things and how I was hurting or whatever, I wasn't sure what I should do. So I asked the Lord in prayer. I said, "What do I do?" And he said, "Love speaks." Love speaks. I said, "What does it say?" And he said, "Freedom. If you love someone else, you don't keep it quiet. If you truly love someone, you don't let it escalate until the point that it falls apart, and then you speak up. If you truly love someone, you bring it up. Hey, I'm hurting. Hey, I'm having a hard time." From the very start, it's God who made himself woundable. It's God who revealed himself so that others might be free. You don't have to go give parish missions about your problems. You don't have to write books about them. You don't even have to decide tonight that you're going to do something new about them. But we at least have to be open to the fact that love himself has revealed himself to us. Is there something stopping me from revealing myself to him? Prayer is the safest place on earth. It is the safest emotional place on earth. You can say anything you want to God. You could be mad at God, you could be happy with God, you could be thankful to God, you could yell at God, whatever you want. God can handle it. Marty Malecki yelled at me for damning him to hell. Oh, man. Are you going to yell at him? Marty's not going to be damned to hell. If you weren't here yesterday, that won't make sense. Just yell at him. Tell him how you feel. He can take it. Because what I've found is that in my own life and in the people that come to me, the things that I've noticed is that if we're unwilling to go to that place, to reveal ourselves to the Lord in prayer, it's because we don't believe that he wants to take care of us. It's because we're stuck in this mindset that we're in competition with him, that he's out to get us somehow. But I want to remind you of this, that specificity is the path to healing. Specificity is the path to healing. How you doing? Oh, doing well. Nothing going on. Nothing too big, I'm fine. Everything's fine. I'm not crying. You're crying, No. If it's someone who's worthy to hear your story, if it's someone who can bear the weight of it, specificity with that person is the path to healing. Think of it like when you have a gigantic blister. You got to pop that thing. You got to get rid of that thing. Let it leak out, okay? That's a gross word, leak. Sorry. You know what I mean. If something is swollen, you put an ice pack on it. There we go. That's a better one. If something is swollen, you put an ice pack on it, and it gets slower over time. We take the step to relieve the pressure. And before we do it, the thought is often, no way in hell. I'm not doing that. That is too much for me. I can't handle it. Everyone's going to make fun of me. No one wants to go there with me. During it, It's going to be like when you clean your bedroom, and I'm just going to put a few things away. I'm just going to move things around. And then 5 hours later, everything you own is around you, you know, and every drawer is empty. And you're like, what the hell did I get myself into? This was stupid. But then after it's completed, the thought is always, thank you, Jesus. I see things differently. I see that I can be made new. I see that things are different in you. So tonight we're going to have the chance to go to confession if we want. And I encourage you to do it. And if you just give the same old confession that you've given every year, every week for 50 years, do it. Fine, it's confession. But my encouragement is to spend a little bit of time in prayer now and to just ask the Lord, what is it that is preventing my freedom? What is it that's preventing me? What am I holding on to? A grudge? Lack of forgiveness? Am I angry at someone? Is there someone who I know is mad at me that I'm afraid to reach out to? Whatever. What is going on in me that's keeping me from being open to you? What is at stake here is not just our freedom, but it's the freedom of the world. And that's where we'll go tomorrow. That hurt people, but free people free people. And so it's not just our freedom, our life in Christ that's at stake, but it's our ability to be attractive to other people. That people will see us, as I said yesterday, and they'll say, what is different about that person? Ah, they're free. They're content in the midst of trial. They're joyful in the midst of woe. They're at peace in the midst of consternation. That's what's different about them. What's your secret? Is it the Atkins diet, you know? And you'll say, no, it's the living God. It's Jesus who is kneading my heart. Here, let me show you what I mean. Let me tell you what I mean. That's tomorrow. So do you believe that Jesus wants to take care of you? Do you believe that Jesus wants to be with you? That he is going to be sitting there on the other side of the screen or on the other side of the chair from you tonight? It's not just old Father Dan. What's up, Father Dan? Nice to see you. It's not just old Father Ryan or Monsignor Jim. It's Jesus working through these men, the priests of the new covenant. Ask them for their business card tomorrow. I bet that's what's on it. But I want to share with you a prayer. I was going through my journal a couple weeks ago, and I want to share with you a prayer that I had written in 2016, April 1st, 2016. Do you know where I was living April 1st, 2016? Right here, 57 Gulf Avenue. I have no words to pray except to say that you, O Spirit, are welcome in my heart. I will fear you, I will resist you, but I want to welcome you. I want to be new and healed by you. Let us go into the field together. May you show me an end to anxiety and the beginning of love and true peace, of joy and resurrection. I have no words to say except that you, O Spirit, are welcome in my heart. Jesus, King of love, we are confident in you. Jesus, we believe that you want to take care of us. Help us to desire to be open, to be known and accepted by you. Give us these holy desires, because you are the speaking, the self-revealing Godhead. Give us the grace and the courage in our own little way to imitate you. We have no words to say tonight except that you, O Jesus, are welcome in our hearts. Amen. So I don't know what the plan is. Doug gave me this finger. He's going to tell us. So I just want to remind you that tomorrow night, after you go to confession, you're free to leave, of course, or you're free to leave before that, but not during it. I don't know. Tomorrow we'll be at the same time at 7 here, and we'll take the next step. Hurt people. So we're going to experience freedom, I hope, so that we see that free people free people. And we create a world of disciples. We create a world of a truly free culture We're not going to change all of society, but if we can change our own little network of relationships, our own lives are going to be so different. So that's where we're going to go tomorrow night, okay? See you then.
So thank you all for being here tonight. Monsignor is over at the Holy Family, and Father Dan is back behind the baptismal font. Father Larry is over here by the Eucharist. Father Ryan is going into the confessional, and we have a couple other priests that are just vesting right now, and there are places right by the stations and then also in the sacristy. So please take your advantage of the sacrament, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow night. Thank you all.